Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on our healer rankings for Dragonflight Season 1. We just saw the release of 10.0.5, a major update for many classes, including healers, specifically Mistweavers, and also Disciplined Priests, with some minor updates to other classes as well. So we're going to check in to see how the healers are ranking up this week in all forms of PvE content. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start things off like we always do by looking at the numbers from last week. So we're currently at the end of week 7 after 10.0.5 went live. These are the numbers on screen for week 6. So last week's numbers for the healers overall. We know that Disciplined Priest was suffering quite a bit in all forms of content. Mistweaver and Holy Priest were, Holy Priest was fine, but they got a major buff in one of the previous class tunings, and then Mistweaver was actually down with Discipline until they got some major buffs in a previous class tuning. However, in this update, we saw a tree rework for some of the Restoration Druid builds. Preservation Evoker had the Temporal Anomaly adjusted. Mistweaver has a brand new talent setup in the bottom right of their tree with Shylun's Gift from Legion, and Discipline saw some pretty big buffs and overall reworks as well for how their talents in the top middle work, how some of their shadow builds work. So let's see how everything changed going into week 7. And boom, here we are with week 7's numbers. Right off the bat, you can see that Discipline did catch up a little bit in the overall numbers. On the left side of the screen, I have them stacked up on the individual areas: Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. Again, I like including Heroic Raid because the group sizes are variable, the difficulty doesn't really constrain any class from performing in a specific way, and you can you're free to roam around and cheat things, and it's a little bit more freer in that aspect, and less restrictive as you would see in Mythic Raid, and oftentimes the numbers can vary because of those reasons. And then Mythic Plus down there at the bottom, and all three of those categories are stacked up together in a stacked bar graph, so we can see what the overall scoring is for each of these. So based on last week's numbers, we can see that Disciplined Priests did shorten that gap a little bit. They are still the lowest in all forms of content, despite Mythic Plus coming up quite a bit. We'll talk about that in a second. But Heroic Raid, in Raid in general, they tend to struggle with being able to perform at the same level as any other class. It doesn't look like the Preservation Evoker changes to Temporal Anomaly. Some of them are nerfs. Some of them are kind of reworks and restricting how abusive Temporal Anomaly with Echo can be. I think overall it ended up being a net neutral. I think it prevents some of the abuse situations where you can stack heal with TA and do some insane throughput, but it didn't take them out of the first place slot. So let's go through each one of them, starting at the top from the bar, the total stacked, and then we'll go down towards the bottom. Number 1 this week, no surprise for anybody, is Preservation Evoker. They are the number 1 in Mythic Raid, they're the number 1 in Mythic Plus, and they're pretty close to tied for first place in Heroic Raid, though we do see Restoration Druids taking that slot from them. Keep in mind, it is a little bit weird to rank healers just by throughput. I think one of the healers that gets it passed in here is Holy Paladin. If Holy Paladin was down at the bottom, people would still bring them because they bring more than just throughput, whereas classes like Restoration Druid, Holy Priest, Mistweaver, they really just bring throughput, and so you want them to be on the higher side of the list. Preservation Evoker doing great in all forms of difficult content. In Heroic Raid, they are being slightly outperformed by Preservation or by Restoration Druids, but I would say they're still in that upper echelon. They still kind of outclass every other healer below them. Underneath them is Restoration Druid. Still overall less performance than the Preservation Evoker, but they did take a slight lead in Heroic Raid, which means, if left to their own devices, if you can make the group 30 people or 35 people or whatever, Restoration Druid can just throw out infinite rejuves, get abundance, and spam regrowths and proc their tree form over and over and over and do some crazy numbers. But in a constricted 20-man group size for Mythic Raid with difficult mechanics that cannot be skipped, Preservation does take the lead there on the output front. They also are second place to them in Mythic Plus. I think Restoration Druid has always been the king and queen of Mythic Plus because they have so many tools. They can heal on the move. They're not very restricted in many ways. They have battle res, which is super nice. They have stealth. They can skip mechanics, things like that. But Preservation Evoker just has them beat on throughput. And not only that, their Empower spells If you're doing Spirit Bloom or Dream Breath, they can on-demand full heal a whole group so much easier than Restoration Druid. They do have to stand still, and they have less mobility than Restoration Druid, but when push comes to shove and you need a big burst of healing, Preservation Evoker right now beats everyone else out in the list. A standard deviation down below underneath Restoration Druid in third place is Holy Priest. Primarily because of their raid performance. You can see that they still are performing quite well in raid. They didn't really see any major degradation from that. In Heroic Raid, they're still handily in the third spot. You can see on the scoring how much further behind number 4 is from Holy Priest. And then in Mythic Raid, they do about middle of the pack. They're not anywhere near as good as Restoration Druid or Preservation Evoker, but they do well enough and they succeed and they're being brought and it's working just great. They have been slipping in Mythic Plus little by little, and I think that comes down to just higher and higher keys. Holy Priest has always had a struggle with surviving. If there's a lot of AoE damage or single target damage going out, Holy Priest is one of the few specs in this list that can just outright die. They don't have a lot of defensives. They don't have a lot of damage reduction or on-demand self-healing that isn't just a cooldown they could be using on someone else. They have to stand still and cast more than some of the classes on this list. So it definitely kind of shows as you get the keys higher and higher, but they have been slipping a bit in Mythic Plus. Kind of encouraging, we're seeing Holy Paladin in the 4th slot overall. They are in the higher level of the mid-tier in Heroic Raid, and they're keeping up with the best of them in Mythic Raid right there in the middle. And then when it comes to Mythic Plus, they've been climbing up. Holy Paladin, whether you use Beacon of Virtue or Beacon of Faith with high haste, they still have crazy survivability. They can tank mechanics. They have Blessing of Protection, which is excellent for a lot of the dungeons in this season, Season 1. So they have a lot of tools, and their throughput is absolutely amazing. They're also super mana efficient because of how much holy power they spend relative to just spending raw mana with casted spells. Underneath Holy Paladin, a bit of a shocker this week is Mistweaver. So Mistweaver has come up significantly in Raid since the addition of the Shailune's Gift with the more caster playstyle on top of the buffs they got earlier in the class tuning prior to that. It hasn't really had a major impact on their Mythic Plus performance. They have, since the beginning of Season 1, been the lowest healer in Mythic Plus, kind of fighting with Discipline for that slot. And the changes that came about didn't really have much impact on them in Mythic Plus at all. So they're still struggling there, but they're doing pretty good in Mythic Raid, Heroic Raid. I mean, they're not at the throughput levels of Holy Priest when left alone, but they do perform well. A lot of Mythic guilds brought Mistweavers this week to test them out, and they did great. They did just fine. I mean, I think that Mistweaver should probably be higher up with Holy Priest, Restoration Druid, Preservation Evoker. Mistweaver is really just a throughput healer, so you would expect a raid healer to be above Holy Paladin, Restoration Shaman, Discipline Priest, just because that's what they do. They don't bring too much else beyond that. But it's encouraging to see that the buffs plus the reworks were enough to kind of bring them off the ground in Raid, but they're still struggling quite a lot in Mythic Plus. In fact, they're underperforming Holy Priest, which is pretty sad to see, and we hope to see hopefully some fixes for that coming soon. Restoration Shaman in the second to last slot. They did come up a little bit. They saw a buff to their Healing Tide totem in small content, which didn't really seem to have much impact on them in Mythic Plus. Not super surprising. It's a 3-minute cooldown. It may not have too much there. They did see some minor changes over the last few patches, but I think throughput-wise, they probably need to be a little bit higher. They're probably underperforming across the board. Doesn't mean you can't complete difficult content with Restoration Shaman. They still bring a bunch of utility and some of the best cooldowns in the game with Spirit Link Totem and things like that. Revive Totem, Absorb Totem. They have a lot of really cool tools, but in the current state, I would like to see them at least be a little bit higher. You can see that they do okay in Heroic Raid, but they are down with Discipline Priest this week or Mythic Raid, which is a bit sad to see. And then in Mythic Plus, they're doing about okay, but the last slot goes to Discipline Priest. And what's cool to see this week is while Discipline is doing quite abysmal, they're actually doing really horrible in Raid. Their throughput numbers are still not good enough The big changes they got with the last patch was they doubled the healing. By the way, they just doubled the healing of Power Word Radiance. Anytime you can just double a spell, it shows how far behind that class actually was. If you took any other spec, like if you went to like a Windwalker Monk and doubled Fists of Fury, the damage on it would not be okay. But Discipline Priest had one of their spells, their big AoE spell, doubled in effectiveness, and they're still at the bottom for most content. They also got Flash Heal and Renew increased, and then they got some changes to the talents right underneath Pain Suppression so that they can have some modifications there, which, you know, it's nice, it's cool. They had some really cool cleanups. I love the cleanup for Shadowy Covenant where it makes Penance Shadow, which means you don't have to wait for a Dark Side proc to do that. All of that's good stuff, but I think overall they do still need some help in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. Although it does seem like this week Discipline was doing actually quite well in Mythic Plus. They're a single point or two away from Restoration Druid. They're kind of caught up with Holy Paladin, and they're outperforming Resto Shaman, Holy Priest, and Mistweaver in Mythic Plus. So in that small 5-man content, they were actually doing quite well this week. They're just struggling still quite a lot on Discipline, which you could have seen this coming because when it comes to Raid, Discipline Priests have maybe 50 to 60% of their healing coming from Atonement, and there were no major changes to Atonement or any kind of Atonement output or throughput modifications in this patch. It was primarily casted healing spells, which would affect Mythic Plus more than anything else. So I guess we'll see what happens in coming patches and scales from there. But this is where everything is for healers in week 7. Comment down below what your thoughts are. Let me know what you're expecting out of this, what you think is going to happen going into week 8, or if there's anything that surprised you, or anything that you think Blizzard should do next. Like, what are they still missing? What changes should they make? And what changes do you think were the best in 10.0.5? As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.